Okay, so here to start off part two, we're basically looking at what happens when the price falls. What we know already, right, if we think back to Econ 130, is that we've got the law of demand, which basically just told us that when the price falls, it leads to an increase in the quantity demanded or a movement along the curve. Now, what this slide starts to tell as the story, and you may have heard it before, but I'll go in detail into it, is that two things are happening. And these two things are happening simultaneously that are contributing to this increase in the quantity demanded. The first being the income effect, the second being the substitution effect. So, um, essentially, when we talk about the substitution effect, we're saying that when the price falls for a product, that the individual will substitute towards that good that is now cheaper relative to the other goods they could have consumed. Now, this substitution effect, which is being described right here, it's not the same as substitution like an orange for a clementine or um, a desktop versus a laptop. We're not talking about those types of substitutions. We could be talking about a can of Pepsi and a computer. And all that we're saying here is that obviously Pepsi and computers do very different things. So they're not substituting for one another. On the other hand, what they're doing, um, what they're doing is that as Pepsi becomes cheaper relative to computers, let's say that's staying constant in price, people will buy more computers. So substitution effect always works in the same direction, no matter what the type of good is. It always means that the consumer will buy more of the good. Sorry, that was really bad. Buys more of the good as it becomes relatively cheaper relative to whatever the other product is. So I substitute towards that cheaper product. The second effect, which is listed right here, is my income effect. Now here, it doesn't always work in the same direction because it would matter whether the good is a normal good or an inferior good. For normal goods, most goods, if the good falls in price, then you feel richer. Not that you're actually richer, but you feel richer. And so you buy more of the product if it's a normal good. If, however, feeling richer leads you to buy less of the good, it's an inferior good, it'll then work in the opposite direction. However, the substitution effect is still stronger than the income effect. The consequence of that is that for both a normal good as well as an inferior good, the demand curve is downward sloping. So here, if it's a normal good, we buy more of the good that falls in price because we feel richer. Inferior good, you buy less of the good. I'm not going to write all this, less of the good. as you feel richer. But no matter what, the substitution effect always overwhelms either. Let's put it this way: either the income effect is reinforcing the substitution effect when it's a normal good, right? It's just adding on to it, buying more of the good. Or in the case of an inferior good, this is a very weak effect, and the substitution effect overwhelms it. And that's kind of what we have described here. So I'm not going to say much more about this because I've just said it. Except for the fact of this, because now we're going to have to graph this out here. In the substitution effect, let's do that. We're holding the level of utility constant, which would mean we want to be on the same indifference curve. And here, we want to be parallel to the original budget constraint. And we're going to see that. So that would mean, because if it's parallel to the original budget constraint, that would keep the relative prices constant. And we'll see that right here. So let's do this actually. Let's draw this out here. So we've got a space here where we've got quantity of food, let's say, and quantity of clothing. I think that's kind of what we're sticking with here. And here's my original budget constraint. And here's my indifference curve. And then the event that's going to happen is the price of food falls. As the price of food falls, the budget constraint pivots outward. And now we know that if we just did this, we'd be on a higher indifference curve and I would consume more food. All is great in the world. Right? We could draw the drop-down graph here and have quantity of food, price of food, and if it went from $1 to 50 cents, and then we could just connect the dots, and you would have that demand curve. Nothing too surprising here. But what we're saying is that two things are happening here. Income effect, which was written right here, and substitution effect, substitution effect and income effect. Let's look at the substitution effect first. Substitution effect says, let's keep the level of the indifference curve constant, the utility constant. So what we need to do here is, I guess I really should have You know what? I need a little more space here. Let me get the eraser. This is not going to affect anything. I just need more space to make it more apparent. So just pretend like I didn't draw that. I'm just going to draw it kind of like way out here so that I got more space. Oh man, that looks ugly. But hopefully you'll get the idea of what I'm doing here. Oh god, it just looks horrible. Let's just get rid of this. Okay. Because you're watching this video, you'll see what's going on. Now let's just redraw the whole thing. Let's just draw it really big now. I don't mind. As long as you don't mind. Again, price of food falling. Pivots the indifference, the budget constraint out. Here's my original indifference curve. I am now on a higher indifference curve. Substitution effect. So when we look at the substitution effect, what we're going to do here is draw a line exactly parallel to this budget constraint. And we're going to keep bringing it inward until it just touches it's not going to look great, but you'll get the idea. So let's pretend that the pink line and the red line are exactly parallel to one another. And it touches that original indifference curve right here. So it's keeping the level of utility constant, but it's reflecting this different relative price ratio. So let's write that down. Substitution effect. Keep level of utility constant, but allow the relative price ratio to change. How did we do those two things? Again, to repeat myself, level of utility constant, we kept that true by being on the original indifference curve. How did we allow the relative prices to change? Because we're now on a line that's exactly parallel, meaning it has the same slope as that new budget constraint slope line. So that's a substitution effect. Income effect. Now, what we're saying is that we we now allow ourselves to have the higher utility level, which would be this point right here. So what that would mean here is that the movement from here to here is my substitution effect, and from here to here is my income effect, and that the two together add up to the total change. Okay, so let's go to this graph right here. You can see a much cleaner drawing that we see the movement from A to B. Again, if we were to draw the demand curve, there would be A, and there would be B. But again, what we're doing is we're breaking down that change from A to B into the income effect and into the substitution effect. And you can see here, I can't really zoom in here, but, or maybe I can actually. View, zoom. Oh, we should totally view that even bigger. Yeah, let's do that. There we go. Let's just erase some of this stuff right here. Okay, so again, we're seeing two things happening here. A to B is where we're going from as the price of food is becoming cheaper. But what we do first is the substitution effect. What the substitution effect says, again, is we want to stay on the original level of utility. So U1, we want to be on the original indifference curve, but we're going to reflect the new relative price ratio. To reflect the new relative price ratio, we need to have a line that's exactly parallel, meaning it has the same slope as the new budget constraint. That would be budget constraint RT. So we draw a line exactly parallel to RT and we keep bringing it in until it just touches the original indifference curve, as it did at D. So that's the substitution effect. And then for the income effect, we essentially allow the level of utility to now change. And so that would then be point B. So A to D is our substitution effect, D to B is our income effect. Now, the only way that this changes would be if we have a inferior good. And in the case of the inferior good, it is still the case that people buy more of an inferior good when the price goes down. So both the normal good and an inferior good have a downward sloping demand curve. But as you can see here, the small change is the fact that the income effect slightly counteracts the substitution effect. So let's explain what's going on here for an inferior good. Inferior good, again, bus tickets, I don't know, cheap McDonald's hamburgers. I don't know, pick your inferior good. Price of bus tickets goes down. Okay, so that the bus tickets going down in price changes the budget constraint from RS to RT. Now, we have to draw a line that's exactly parallel to RT and bring it inwards until it just touches the original indifference curve. That would be this line right here. Because it has the new relative price ratio, but the original utility. So that would be A to D. And then what we say is we allow ourselves to be on the higher utility level, which is at B. So it slightly goes backwards. From D to B is the income effect. But ultimately, we're still moving from A to B, which is still an increase as the price goes down. So that's the inferior good. I don't know why I don't control my discipline, obviously. My discipline is a odd discipline that I can't control. Sorry. Um, it's I don't know why my discipline of economics focuses on this extreme. The extreme being the fact that there's a very special kind of good known as the Giffen good, where the demand curve is actually upward sloping. It is, in my opinion, the dumbest thing that people focus their attention on. I don't know why you would want to give this any of your mental bandwidth. And yet, textbooks still talk about it. And if I don't do it, you're going to tell your next econ professor, hey, Scheiding doesn't cover the Giffen good in intermediate micro. And then, I don't know, people will throw upward sloping demand curves at me. Let's talk first about why it's called a Giffen good. Um, there was a person. Um, let's go further back here. So the very first economics textbook written um, came out in 1895, and it it talked about the demand curve and the supply curve, and it talked about the fact that there was an economist named Giffen who had talked about potatoes during the Irish potato famine and how people bought more potatoes during the Irish potato famine, devoted more of their money to potatoes during the Irish potato famine, despite the fact that they were going up in price. And what he said, what Giffen had said, and how Marshall explained it in the textbook he had written in 1895, is um, that potatoes were such an extreme income good, inferior good. They were so extreme that um, the income effect actually overwhelmed the substitution effect. But it was such a special case that that the only reason why it worked out that way was this kind of notion of, well, people from Ireland really only know how to cook with potatoes. All their recipes that are, handed down generation after generation are all potato based. And so as everything was becoming more expensive during the Irish potato famine, people still bought potatoes because that's what they do. That's what Irish people do. So that's what Giffen wrote, and that's what a few generations of economists remembered. The only problem with that is that during the Irish potato famine, the Irish potato consumer was also growing potatoes as well. So their income was presumably going up as well. So it wasn't a very good um, explanation. So it was later determined that potatoes during the Irish potato famine weren't really an inferior good. And then for decades and decades and decades, for nearly a century, economists have been focused on finding another Giffen good. Why the fuck does anyone care? Um, it's the dumbest thing ever. I don't know what else to say. It's just incredibly dumb waste of time. Well, finally in 2000, I think it was 2010, 2009, 2010, in the American Economic Review, which is the big journal for economics, an economist found that there's a certain province in China where consumers bought more of that special particular grain of rice in that one particular province. As the price went up, that people bought more of it. Like, who cares? It is so extreme of an example. But okay, now I've at least talked about it enough that you understand how dumb this is. And quite frankly, if your next professor asks you about the Giffen Good, you should just laugh in their face and just say, dude, why should we waste our time studying it? It's dumb. There's no purpose to it. I like theory and abstract models, but I still think that they have a purpose at some point. Giffen Goods have no purpose except to waste paper and to waste your time. So what does that mean? You're probably not going to see an exam question about a Giffen Good because I don't frankly want you to remember too much about it. But let's just still talk about it. So whatever this Giffen Good, it's falling in price. So it's going from A to B. So the price, the quantity is going up. The quantity is going down as the price is going down. So that would be upward sloping. Um, let's look at the two things here. Sorry. So we draw the line, we draw the new budget constraint line. That means that it goes from um, this dark blue line right here to this dashed blue line right here. And then I draw a line exactly parallel to that dashed blue line, which gives me this lighter shade blue line. So A to D is my substitution effect. Always increase, even in the Giffen Good. Sorry. Even with the Giffen Good, people buy more of the good as it becomes cheaper relative to other goods. But then we're saying again with the income effect is that as people feel richer, they now really buy a lot less of whatever this good is. This is a very, very strong inferior good. And so we have the line that's we allow ourselves to now be on the higher indifference curve, which is now at B. So D to B is the income effect. Overwhelming, obviously, A to D, which is the substitution effect. Who cares? I really, I mean, no, yeah, I don't know. The book does it because it does it. It's always done it that way, and I've had to learn it and suffer through it. And now you should have to suffer through it, and that's what's happening here. Okay. Um, I don't want to make these lectures too long. I want to kind of. I'm going to skip this example only because it doesn't have a lot of that we're going to talk about here. Okay. Let's just stop. Let's erase this so it stops showing up. Okay. So now we're moving to the next section, 4.3, where we're basically now going to add up the individual demand curves to get a market demand curve. Pretty simple. All we're saying is that we're going to add up, in this case, the three individuals, A, B, and C, and then we're going to say at the price of $1 that we have 32 total units across all three individuals. So it's basically demand curves are additive. We would add them up horizontally. So we can see that in the table here, and then you can see this graphically here. This shouldn't be too difficult. It could mean that your market demand curve is not as smooth as it used to be. It has pivots, as it does here. And the reason why it has pivots is because that price is higher than 4. Your person A has dropped off. We could imagine that, well, we don't have to imagine. It would be the case that person B also is going to fall off at some higher price, and then you're going to be left with just C. So it's both additive numerically, as we see in this chart, this table. It's additive graphically, just adding them up horizontally here. And essentially what we see is that from a marketing perspective, right, where you're concerned about what the overall demand is in the market, there's basically two ways to approach that. The one is getting each individual demand curve to grow, but also expanding the market, bringing more individuals into the market. And so both of those things happen, the market demand curve grows. And then we get to what I think is the most important topic in this chapter. It's largely um, what my dissertation was on from a PhD. Um, it's just it's just the one thing in this entire course that if you don't remember much from this very course, mastering elasticity just tells you so much about the world. Let's remind ourselves what elasticity is. Elasticity, when you see the word elasticity, think of it as sensitivity. How sensitive are things? So, what we know, ooh, I'm going to add this because that's how important this is. Elasticity. Dude, it's so important. Look at all these fireworks I'm shooting off here, Hawaii style, about how important this is. What does that do? Okay, and then look how important it is. Elasticity of demand. Very, very important. Oh shit, how do I turn it off? Oh fuck. That's not good. There we go. Okay. So when you see the word elasticity, think sensitivity. You cannot succeed in business in selling something if you do not know what the sensitivity is of your product. You know for a fact that outside of the crazy Giffen Good people, that as the price falls, quantity demanded goes up. Yes, yes, yes. Or, alternatively, as the price goes up, quantity demanded falls. But what is that really telling us? Because if we're a business, we don't care necessarily how little or how much we're selling. We care about total revenue, which in turn determines for us total profit. I might have fewer customers if I raise the price, but those fewer customers, the remaining customers are going to be paying me more money. And so let me talk a little bit about my long ago dissertation, but why it just, even something as mundane as I'm about to talk about, why it was how elasticity tells us so much more. So my research was on how um, when academics write up their work, they write up their work in a scholarly journal. Now, the academic has an incentive, is encouraged to write up their work in the research journal because that's what gets them tenure, that's what gets them promotions. And there's a very small set of people who will read that research, right, and it'll help them do their research. But the thing about the journal as well is that you can read the research without buying the journal if you go to a library, right? And you can read that journal and get the work for free. But there's also a set of people who really want to get that research delivered to their doorstep whenever the journal is published. And so there's going to be some people who have a subscription to the journal. So you've got three different groups of people. You have the person writing the article who gets some benefit to doing it, to writing the article. And then you've got the public who benefits to reading the research when they read it at the library. And then you've got the other economists who benefit because it helps them do their research, who are subscribing to it, the journal. This is what we would call a quasi public good. It's a quasi public good because both the public benefits from this good, but also individuals benefit from this product as well. And so, what my research was basically saying is that we have the wrong pricing mechanisms for journals if we only require the reader to pay to get the journal in their hands. That instead, what we should do is charge everyone a price that benefits in some way to the journal article being published. That the author should pay something, the library should pay something because it's getting all that benefit to the public, and that the individual subscriber should pay something. How much do you charge them though? That's where you would want to know the elasticity. For a journal like the American Economic Review, which is the top journal in economics, and if an economist publishes in that journal, it means a significant increase in their salary, significant um, professional rewards. They should be willing to pay quite a bit to publish in that journal. And, far exceeding whatever the costs were to publish their journal. And researchers that are reading that research should pay something for that access, but they shouldn't necessarily, this is going to sound odd, but they shouldn't necessarily pay what it costs to print that article and to mail it. It's going to be some price not determined by the costs of actually publishing the journal, but again, a price determined by how much benefit they get from it. And same for the public. What I've kind of described here, though, is that there's also then a difference in elasticity. If the author of the article is benefiting a great deal from publishing in the American Economic Review, then they are pretty inelastic in their demand. Meaning they wouldn't even care if you want to charge them, you know, I don't know, $50 a word. Because there is no equivalent journal that would give them such professional rewards. So they'd be willing to pay a very high price. Whereas the reader is a bit more elastic because maybe they could just write a personal letter to the author and say, hey, can you send me a copy of your research? Or now with the internet, you can just type in the title and I'm sure you'd find it free posted somewhere. And then certainly an individual having a subscription, at some point the individual will just say, I'll just read the library copy. I don't need it right away. But the library, in some sense, almost has to buy it because they're supposed to be the repository of like all this research that's being done, so they have to have it. So the library, as the kind of collection of readers, is more inelastic, less sensitive than the individual subscriber, who's more elastic, and the author is pretty inelastic. And what you can do, as I did in my research, you can basically then structure who to charge and how much to charge them based on their elasticities. Now, it's a little bit more complicated in my quasi public good case So let's look at it a bit easier here. Let's just look at it in terms of a private good. Let's say that I'm selling diapers, okay? And we live in a world right now where there's pretty high inflation. The challenge, the primary economic challenge being faced right now, today, June 2021, 2022, fuck, June 2022. The primary economic challenge faced right now is, are businesses going to pass on the higher costs that they have? Well, it depends based on what the elasticity is of the demand for their product. Diapers as a whole are pretty inelastic. You need diapers if you have a baby, but you don't need Pampers, the particular brand, which is almost the same as Huggies, which is almost the same as, I don't know, the like Up and Up brand or whatever that Target brand is. Okay, so what each of those companies would need to do, the makers of Up and Up, the maker of Pampers, and the maker of Huggies, what they all need to determine is how unwilling is a consumer to change brands based on the price. Because with diapers, right, a size 3 might be a size 3, and who cares if it's from Pampers or Huggies? Um, maybe, right? Or maybe you do some work to lock customers in to keep buying your diapers, right? You set up a reward program or some other kind of thing to lock them in. But pretty much diapers, it's really hard to lock customers in. So as a result, as a consequence of that, the individual brands, Huggies and Pampers, turns out that they have pretty elastic demand, which means that if I change the price by 1%, the quantity demanded changes by some amount greater. Falls by some amount greater than 1%, which would mean that in terms of total revenue, my total revenue would fall. Revenue being price times quantity. So this would be going up 1%, but this would be falling by, let's say, 5%. So total revenue would fall. So there's the problem right now, is that the predicament being faced is that Procter and Gamble, the makers of Procter and Gamble, the makers of Pampers, and Kimberly Clark, the maker of Huggies, finds that each of those individual companies are unable to pass on their higher prices. So their profits are taking a hit. And eventually, at some point, shareholders of those respective companies will get grumpy enough to demand change, demand that the prices go up, which would mean that the inflation we're seeing right now is being muted, being reduced by the fact that businesses are unable to pass on some of their higher prices. Eventually, though, they will pass on those higher prices, thus causing inflation to go up even more, in my opinion. For inelastic demand, well, this is a situation where you can pass on the higher prices. Um, oh, I mean, the classic one would still be things like prescription drugs, um, where you have a monopoly. And if the disease you're trying to cure is bad enough that people want to cure it. So again, we have this example of there's a new Alzheimer's drugs, which isn't exactly proven to be really good at curing, not certainly curing it, but at least slowing it down. Um, and you can basically charge whatever you need to charge, and people will still buy it because you have no alternative. So what we're looking at here in terms of elasticity, price elasticity of demand, we're looking at percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in price. And this will be negative because of the law of demand. Okay. So what that would mean here is that we have our demand curve. Okay. Downward sloping, no big surprises here. But what that means is that in terms of total revenue, right, and I'm selling an inelastic good, if I'm selling an inelastic good and I increase the price, then my total revenue will go up as well. I don't know why they use total expenditures. Let's just call it total revenue. It's the same thing. So the drug maker doesn't face a lot of indecision here about whether to pass on their higher prices. They totally can because um, the demand for their product is so inelastic. As opposed to someone who's selling an elastic good where their costs might be increasing, but they know if they were to pass on their higher costs and increase the price, their total revenue would go down. They would lose so many customers. So ultimately, they cannot change anything here. That right there is what would make you a valuable manager. What would make you a valuable part of a business operation is what is your ability to pass on higher prices. Because if the consumer is only looking at price and you haven't locked them in any other way and they're only making their decision based on price, you'll lose them if it's an elastic good that you're selling. So then you either need to make marketing efforts to lock them in some way, right? Create a reward program or something like that. Let me give you the kind of example I'm facing right now. So I think, as I said in my previous lecture, I fly Southwest Airlines primarily. It's a convenient airline, and I usually have to fly out about once a month, and it's an easy kind of airline to work with. But before that, I used to fly with Delta. And then there came some point where just Delta was really, really increasing the prices a lot. And for a while, I tolerated it because I had like all these miles. I had like, this like certain status, and, they locked you in pretty well. But eventually, at some point, even that ability to lock me in got so exhausting that I just said, fuck it. I'm just, going to give it up and just go to this. So it's not like, um, you're basically creating a barrier to departure. You want to at least give some people a reason not to leave you right away. If you create like a reward program or something like that, but you'd still have to accept the fact that people may still leave you. And so um, we'll solve a problem like this in the problem set. I'm just going to skip it though for right now, just because I want to keep lecture on lecture, and we'll do the problems as a separate video. So let me skip over this right now just to get us to consumer surplus. And so with consumer surplus, what we're doing here is, um, we're looking at the fact that, um, when someone buys a product, they're indicating that they were willing to pay at least that amount. That's why they bought it. But people, if you could ask them as a business, if you could have asked them, they may have been willing to pay more. And that's the challenge: finding a consumer's reservation price. We all have what's called a reservation price, which is our highest price we're willing to pay. And it can change for a lot of reasons, but imagine it being a really, really, really hot day. How much would you pay for a cold can of soda? Probably quite a bit. Yet, the price on the vending machine is always the same price, let's say, $1.50 for a can. In some sense, right, you would totally buy that $1.50 can because it's so hot and that can of soda is going to be so nice and cold. You'd be like, yeah, that's a total deal. I'm totally going to buy it. And you'd feel really, really good about it. Meaning that there'd be a big difference between the price you paid and what you would have been willing to pay. And then let's say it's hot, but it's not as hot as it used to be. So then you would have been willing to pay that price as opposed to that price. And then let's say even cooler, even cooler, even cooler, even cooler, and down to here. And so what you would have are all these differences. So that's if for the same consumer. Imagine them being though different consumers. One who like really needs that morning caffeine. That would be this person, right? The person way on this end here. The person who doesn't like sugary drinks but tolerates them would be like right here. The person who hates sugary drinks, thinks they're the work of the devil, right? That'd be way down here. And you're going to get some person over here who's really health conscious who wouldn't even be willing to pay the $1.50. So they don't get it even. The goal of the business, in some sense, should be to find consumers' reservation prices. Now, for most businesses, you don't have multiple prices. You don't charge different customers different prices. Um, but there are some businesses that do have an ability to extract different prices from consumers. Airlines being one example. UH is another example, right? Most of you are paying different prices based on your willingness to pay for the product. So the surplus, actually, another place where you see it quite a bit is actually on eBay. So on eBay, I actually sell quite a bit of stuff on eBay. And my advice to anyone who ever wants to sell something on eBay is you may think the thing that you have is just a piece of old junk, but you would be surprised sometimes how quickly someone will buy that stupid piece of junk for a stupid expensive price. Um, Basically anything, dude. I mean, right? My wife is in finance, and she has these like really old tax guides, which is like this like really old. I don't know. It's like 3 years old, and it talks about the tax code from 3 years ago in very deep detail for like an accountant. It's 3 years old. The tax code has changed in the past 3 years. And I kid you not, I am selling these extra copies that I was just going to throw out. And I was like, I'll just try to sell it. I have been selling them for $75 a pop, like one after the other after the other. I've sold two this week. What? what are people doing with 3-year-old tax guides? I don't know what they're doing with it, but clearly they're doing something with it. So much so that they're willing to pay 75 bucks for it. I don't care what they're doing with it, to be quite honest. Um, and I'm not even selling it, I'm selling it as a straight flat price because I don't want to deal with auctions. If I had an auction going, there I could really be determining what each individual's highest willingness to pay would be. I'm not even bothering with that. So if you want to buy a 3-year-old tax guide, talk to me. I'll sell it to you for a discount. Okay. So then we can start to draw out what that consumer surplus looks like. So the consumer surplus would be the area below the demand curve to the price, and then the actual amount spent would be the square below the market price to the origins. So your equation for solving that space would be 1/2 base times height. That would be the difference between the market price and your y-intercept and the equilibrium quantity, and taking it times 1/2. And we'll have some problems where we're going to look at that too. And again, I'm just going to skip the examples to get us to our final topic for this chapter, which again is a pretty long chapter. But it takes us to network externalities. So these are products where the product becomes more useful the more people that use it. So um, the old example, which really is old at this point, would be what's the value of people using email, right? Email becomes more valuable if more people use email. Fax machines become more valuable and useful as more people have fax machines. Um, on the contrast, though, right, they become less valuable the fewer the people have them. Like, who sends a fax anymore? There's some. My wife, in her industry, they still rely on faxes quite a bit, but that's pretty old technology. Um, and so you see network externalities. Actually, where you really saw them was in the Social Network movie, right? In the Facebook movie, Social Network, um, because right, the value of that social networking site, Facebook, was that all of your friends were on it, right? And I guess I'm still on it, but I don't even really use it that much because it's I felt it was too intrusive, but also um, the people that I know very well, they're not using it anymore, so it becomes less useful. Um, so that would mean that when you're running a business like this, right, that you want to do all that you have to do to get people to use that more often. The other example being iPhones again, right? As more people use iPhones, then you can use iPhone specific kinds of things, right? Like message, right, where we all have the blue circles instead of the green, or we can use AirDrop, or we can use FaceTime, the things that are unique to the Apple space and that make owning something that's Apple more valuable than not. And the way that we see this here is that people buy even more of the product, that the demand increases dramatically so as it increases on its own. So that's basically our bandwagon effect, that it becomes more valuable as more and more people use it. Now, it works in the opposite direction as well. And here we're saying that the demand curves are still downward sloping, but now they're negative, or they're that as they increase, fewer people are buying them. Um, Let's think of a good example of what's a brand that's like overdone? Um, well, I guess to some extent, um, some certain fashion items. I'm not obviously the person to talk to about fashion, but um, you could imagine that whatever Target sells as fashionable, everyone else has already done it by that point, and so fewer people want to look like everyone else, and so fewer people would buy that Target brand, right? So Target was the big hit in the, I don't know, late early 2000s, early 2010s, but now, right, people are buying from like smaller stores, more particular kinds of stores. And so there we see these Facebook examples again of people, more users using Facebook as it grows, but then also spending more time on it. The problem is that it's going slightly in the reverse direction now, though, is that people are dropping off. Probably because Shiting dropped off. So now people are like, I don't need to be on it anymore. Really, but you get the idea. Okay. Um, so make sure. Again, um, we're gonna, I think, yeah, the rest of this we'll deal with in the problem set. And the problem set will deal with the empirical estimation. Okay, and then you don't need to worry about the appendix. Okay, that ends our discussion of, excuse me, of chapter 4.